Keith, I mean, I described you a little while back. We've probably all forgotten your biog. Can you just briefly describe what the Infrastructure Projects Authority is all about, what your role is, and also then just bring in the Infrastructure Client Group that we've already heard a little bit about?
Okay, so the Infrastructure and Projects Authority is a relatively new organisation that came around at the start of this year, formed in January, merging what was Infrastructure UK in the Treasury and the Major Projects Authority that sat in the Cabinet Office. So its remit really is focusing on improving the delivery of major projects, be they in infrastructure or in defence or IT procurement. And often there's a bit of confusion about where we sit in relation to the National Infrastructure Commission or the Treasury spending teams. And I suppose the easiest way to describe it is the Commission are all about the long-term vision. So they're about what do we need in the future and why. Then the government departments and the spending teams then set out what's going to be done about it, the spending plans. And then our job really is the how. How do we deliver those projects better? How do we deliver better outcomes from that? And recognising that we don't directly procure works ourselves. We work with major clients, be they public sector like the Environment Agency, or through the regulated sector like Anglian Water, or the private sector themselves. And we use a grouping called the Infrastructure Client Group, which we brought together about 5 years ago, really when we were looking to try and improve the capital efficiency of construction projects. We're trying to get a 15% saving out of the construction phase of projects, like Crossrail, like High Speed 2, like our flood defence programme. And really it brought together a group of very senior leaders from client organisations to look at a number of issues about how to engage more collaboratively with the supply chain, how they should use procurement more sensibly, what we could do about standardisation of approaches to bring greater consistency to the market, and looking at areas about how to reduce carbon. And in fact, it was really something that was driven by the Green Construction Board and the belligerent Chris Newsom over in the back there, who was quite vocal in getting the Treasury to agree in their non-normal, warm, fluffy sense that reducing carbon was a good thing. Because there was a very strong case made that reducing carbon reduces cost. And it wasn't about just trying to cut carbon for the sake of cutting carbon. It was recognising that by doing that, it was driving down cost and it was improving the performance of our infrastructure. So really we've moved away from how do we do the same thing cheaper through a phase of how do we do the same thing better to really now looking at how do we do better things. So we're looking at the whole life performance of our assets, and really carbon is an excellent tool to get us thinking innovatively, to get us collaborating across clients as well as within the supply chains to start delivering those longer term objectives.
So you talked a little bit about how government thinking has been evolving in terms of carbon reduction and infrastructure. What's the current thinking at the moment, though? And given the Paris Agreement, we've been now thinking about the possibility of recalibrating, where we need to be in terms of carbon post 2050. What's the current view in government?
Well, I think we perhaps need to move away from what has been a traditional capital bias in our thinking. It's not all about building new projects. If you look at the assets we have in the UK and what we'll have in about 30 years' time, about 90% plus of what we've got at the moment is what we'll have then. So it's not just about how do we build new things better, it's how do we get better performance out of our existing assets. And that's where things like technology, smart thinking, Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, all those wonderful bits of technology will help us think about delivering the performance of the infrastructure. And it's not about departments saving money by cutting corners or doing things on the cheap. It's about delivering better services and better products for the consumers and end users. And that requires us to think innovatively. It requires us to think about the whole life. It requires us to think about how individual assets connect with others as well. So, for example, how does a highway scheme unlock regeneration and housing development around its axis? So we need to be thinking in a much broader sense about the whole life performance of assets rather than focusing on the construction element alone.
So how does that then influence the thinking of the Infrastructure Client Group? And where are they on that in terms of setting clear guidance around what they're trying to achieve, which I think is an important message going into the supply chain?
Yeah, and I think one of the bits of feedback we've had from industry about the Infrastructure Client Group is it's not that they are individually perfect, and with respect to my fellow panelists, they're not. It's in fact what they are is showing greater levels of consistency in their approach. And many of the suppliers we talk to are working for most of the different members of the client group. And what they value and what they've recognised is we're seeing the different clients starting to speak on common issues in a similar way. Not every project, not every client is trying to develop a bespoke solution that works for them and them alone. They recognise the benefits of collaborating amongst themselves to present a more consistent voice to industry, which allows industry then to think about how do we invest strategically for the market, not tactically for the project. And that's the thing that starts unlocking some of this great thinking on technology, some of the great thinking on carbon. So if we see something working really well on one project today in one sector, through the client group, that peer challenge, that peer collaboration, we're more likely to see the same sort of thing happening elsewhere in another sector much quicker. So we're now talking about what is thought to be world-class today, becoming business as usual much quicker through the collaborative efforts, not of the clients with their suppliers, but the clients themselves sharing best practice and what works well amongst themselves. We've seen examples where clients come to a meeting and said, I've got this real problem here. And one of the other clients, well, actually, we had that 2 years ago. This is what we did. So rather than going through a lengthy process to design a bespoke solution, we're now seeing that sharing of best practice happening very, very rapidly.
And just to be clear, I mean, there may be someone out there in the audience who's saying, well, what's the composition of this client group? Just very briefly, who are they?
Well, we've got Crossrail, High Speed 2, TfL, Network Rail, Highways England, Environment Agency, Anglian Water, Thames Tideway Tunnel, UK Power Networks, National Grid, NDA, Hinkley, and probably someone else.
Okay. And finally, okay, if there's someone out there that says, well, these are my customers, what guidance, what would you be telling them from what you've heard today? What are the must-haves? What are the things that if you were in their community, you'll be saying, well, actually, you're a fool if you're not doing this? What
I'd like to think that suppliers are doing, we're seeing a lot of that now, is thinking about the customers of the clients, the users of their services, the people who are using their water systems, travelling on their networks, having their homes and businesses protected. What is it that those client organisations are being measured on themselves, and how do you actually help them achieve their objectives? Which I think gets people thinking more around the long-term solution and the benefits delivered by the investment in infrastructure, rather than just a narrow focus on the capital project themselves. And that requires maturity from both the client organisations in being able to articulate their requirements clearly, and the supply chain themselves to understand their client's business and what the users of their client's services want from that service themselves.
Great. So in a sense, it's really thinking about how we work together to drive the outcomes that really matter in terms of quality of life for our citizens.
Yeah, the
at the end of the day, what's the point of this infrastructure if it doesn't do that?
Yeah, the outcome is high-performing infrastructure assets, not cheap construction projects.